The year is 1959. 9 Soviet hikers set up a camp in the Ural Mountains and never came back. When rescuers found their abandoned tent, it was cut open from the inside. They left everything behind. Down the slope, more bodies were discovered, some barefoot, some with crushed bones, and one missing her tongue. Welcome to Velanox. You're watching the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery where the cold wasn't the only thing waiting in the dark. The expedition began as a routine challenge. Igor Dyatlov, a track leader, organized the trip with his fellow university hikers. Their goal was to earn the highest level Soviet hiking certification. All of them were fit, experienced, and well equipped for the brutal winter. They began their journey from Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, home of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, traveling north by train towards the Ural wilderness. On January 25th, the group arrived at District 41, a logging camp deep in the Urals, one of the last outposts where they would see other people. They stayed overnight, wrote a couple of diary entries and watched several films, including Symphony in Gold, a musical romance movie from 1956. Zinaida Kolmogorova, one of the group members, even mentioned wanting to watch the film again. She liked it that much. It was their last bit of a normal life before heading to the wild. On February 1st, they set up a camp on an exposed slope of Holachahol, translated by local Mansi tribes as Dead Mountain. It was an unusual spot to pitch a tent, especially when a forested area a little bit below would have offered more shelter. Some believe that Dyatlov wanted to use higher elevation as an extra challenge. What happened that night remains one of the biggest mysteries. Sometime in the dark, something drove the group into a frenzy. They slashed open their own tent from the inside and fled into a raging snowstorm. Investigators found footprints running down the hill, some barefoot and the other one in the socks. At the tree line, searchers discovered the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko, lying beside a scorched patch of earth beneath a cedar tree. They were wearing only their underwear and had attempted to build a small fire. Krivonischenko's hands were badly burned. A piece of flesh had been bitten from his own knuckle, still found between his teeth. It was clear that they had died in agony, perhaps in the state of panic. Further down the slope, 3 more bodies were found. The leader of the group, Igor Dyatlov himself, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They were all oriented in a direction suggesting that they had been trying to return to the tent. Like the others, they were barely clothed. Slobodin had a skull fracture, but it wasn't fatal. All 3 had died of hypothermia. It took until May for the snow to melt enough to find the remaining 4 bodies. They were discovered in a ravine, partially buried under 4 meters or approximately 13 feet of snow. Unlike the others, they were dressed more warmly, wearing the clothes scavenged from their friends. But their injuries were brutal. Lyudmila Dubinina had her ribs crushed, her tongue missing, and her eyes gone. Nikolai Stibobrignol's skull had been so badly damaged that death would have been nearly instantaneous. Alexander Kolavatov's corpse showed less trauma, but his body, like the others, shows sign of exposure to extreme force, without any external bruising or damage to the skin. Forensic experts concluded that the missing tongue and eyes were likely the result of a natural decomposition and exposure to water in the ravine, not the violence. Their external injuries, though, remained a puzzle. Massive trauma, yet no outward signs of attack. The Dyatlov group departed in late January, carrying skis, diaries, and a bunch of cameras. Along the way, they joked about the snowmen and even created a mock newspapers for their track. Their excitement was pretty big, and the journey, though intensive, was nothing new to them. They were professionals. By January 12th, they were expected to return. Delays were normal in the mountains, but as more days passed with no contact, families grew anxious. By February 20th, the Ural Polytechnical Institute and the Soviet government dispatched search parties, and on February 26th, the tent was discovered. It was partially buried, still containing most of the hikers' gear. Oddly, the tent flap was closed, but the back wall had been slashed open from the inside. Wood remained untouched. Clothing was left behind. The searchers even found a flashlight placed on the top of the tent and still worked, perhaps acting as some kind of SOS beacon. The only tracks were those of the hikers themselves, leading away. The condition of the scene baffled the searchers. The fire beneath the cedar tree suggested a fight for survival. Broken branches above, reaching nearly 5 meters or approximately 16 feet high, hinted someone had climbed the tree, possibly searching for the tent or an escape. The arrangement of the bodies and their partial nudity suggested a sequence of events, rather than a single catastrophic moment. It was not a mass panic, it was a slow unraveling. When the final bodies were uncovered in the spring, things grew even stranger. Their injuries were inconsistent with any natural disaster. There were no animal attacks, no evidence of any external trauma, and yet the internal injuries were equal in magnitude to those sustained in high-speed car accidents. And then came the radiation. Samples taken from some of the hikers' clothing showed elevated levels of radiation, particularly on Dubinina and Zolotaryov. Soviet radiologist Dr. Levashov confirmed readings that exceeded normal background levels. However, levels were not high enough to cause the acute radiation poisoning, and two of the hikers, Krivonischenko and Kolevatov, had prior work or exposure in nuclear industries. The contamination was likely carried in on their clothing. Still, it was just enough to spark speculation that hasn't faded since. There are many theories claiming it was an avalanche. A slab of snow collapsing onto the tent could explain the panic and some of the crushing injuries. Modern research supports this. In 2021, scientists using simulation data concluded that a small slab avalanche, possibly triggered by the group digging into the slope, could have struck the tent hours later. It could produce enough blunt force to crack ribs and skulls without leaving external marks, explaining the trauma. Could it have been a katabatic wind? What is that? That is a form of a rare but violent gust of descending cold air. Survivors of similar storms have described hurricane force winds out of nowhere. This could have rapidly piled snow above the tent, possibly triggering the slab. It also can explain the decision to flee down the tree line rather than to stay put. Then, there's a theory of Soviet weapons testing. Some believe the hikers stumbled into a restricted military zone. Others suggest they were victims of an accidental airburst, perhaps from parachute mines. These devices are designed to explode mid-air, producing powerful shockwaves. The damage would have been internal. The surrounding forest would remain mostly undisturbed. Glowing orange orbs were reported in the sky that night by witnesses in nearby towns. Military records remain incomplete or classified. Some clothing contained elevated levels of radiation. The lead investigator later said he was pressured to close the case. Then we have more speculative theories. UFOs, aliens, interdimensional portals. These are fringe ideas, but not impossible, given the lack of a satisfying explanation. Lastly, the theory of paradoxical undressing. Victims of hypothermia often feel an intense sensation of warmth just before death and strip off their clothes. That could explain the state of two bodies, but it doesn't explain the rest. Those who scavenged layers from the dead and tried to survive longer. This wasn't a mass hypothermic madness. It was methodical, desperate survival. The truth? Each theory explains part of the story. None explains it all. So, why does this case still haunt people? Because it resists closure. It offers just enough evidence to spark theories, but never enough to confirm one. And because the Soviet Union wasn't exactly transparent, every gap in the record invites some kind of suspicion. When the official verdict was delivered, It used the phrase "a compelling natural force" killed the hikers. No clarification, no follow-ups. Case closed. But what is a compelling natural force? An avalanche? A blizzard? Radiation? The government said nothing more. And people noticed. The secrecy, the missing files, the incomplete autopsies, all of it fed a growing belief that a full story had been buried. As the Cold War thawed, the Dyatlov Pass became a symbol, not just of a tragedy, but of silence, of how states can erase truth with one red stamp, and of how sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones we can't explain. So, what really happened on that mountain? Maybe it was a tragic mix of wind, snow, and fear. Maybe it was an experiment gone wrong. Maybe it was something we weren't meant to know. 9 young people ran from their tent into the night. Whatever they saw, or thought they saw, it was just enough to make them leave warmth for certain death. Their last moments are locked in ice, frozen in a mystery that has resisted time, reason, and science. The Dyatlov Pass incident reminds us that even in our modern world, some places and some nights still belong to the unknown. If this kind of mystery makes you uncomfortable like the Siberian wind, join me next time as we uncover more secrets that the world forgot. Because sometimes, the real danger isn't what's out there, it's what's been hidden all along.